Chapter 1. The Invitation to Blackthorn Manor. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Hercule Poirot's London flat, casting delicate patterns on the polished mahogany desk. Poirot sat upright in his chair, his hands neatly folded, his sharp eyes scanning the letter before him. The envelope, thick and cream-coloured, bore the unmistakable crest of the Blackthorne family, a raven perched atop a chalice. Mon ami, Poirot murmured to himself, his moustache twitching with curiosity. This is not an ordinary summons. The letter, written in a precise, almost imperious hand, read, "Dear Monsieur Poirot, I find myself in dire need of your expertise. A relic of great historical significance, the Blackthorn Chalice, has brought nothing but misfortune to my family. Death, betrayal, and ruin follow in its wake. I fear the curse is real, and I am at a loss. I implore you to visit Blackthorn Manor at your earliest convenience. Your reputation precedes you, and I believe you are the only one who can unravel this mystery. Yours sincerely, Lord Alistair Blackthorne Poirot leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. A cursed chalice, death and betrayal. It was the kind of case that appealed to his sense of order and logic. Yet something about the letter's tone, its urgency, its almost theatrical phrasing, gave him pause. "A curse, you say?" he muttered, his eyes narrowing. "No, no, there is no such thing as a curse, only the clever machinations of men." He rose from his chair, his movements precise and deliberate, and began to pack his small valise. A change of clothes, his notebook, and a few essential toiletries. Poirot believed in travelling light, even when venturing into the unknown. The journey to Blackthorn Manor was a quiet one. The train rattled through the countryside, the fields a blur of green and gold. Poirot spent the time reviewing what little he knew of the Blackthorne family. They were an old aristocratic lineage, their wealth tied to land and antiquities. The chalice, he recalled, was said to be a medieval relic, rumoured to have been used in a royal coronation. But its history was shrouded in mystery, and now it seemed in tragedy. As the train pulled into the small station near Blackthorn Manor, Poirot stepped onto the platform, his sharp eyes taking in the surroundings. The village was quaint, almost too quiet, with cobblestone streets and ivy-covered cottages. A driver in a black car awaited him, his expression sombre. "Monsieur Poirot?" the man asked, his voice low. "Oui," Poirot replied, inclining his head. "Lord Blackthorne sent me to fetch you. The manor is just a short drive away." The car wound its way through narrow lanes, the trees growing denser as they approached. The estate. Blackthorn Manor loomed into view, a sprawling Gothic structure of grey stone, its turrets piercing the sky like jagged teeth. The windows, dark and lifeless, seemed to watch Poirot's arrival with silent suspicion. The car came to a halt at the foot of the grand staircase. Poirot stepped out, his gaze sweeping over the manor's imposing facade. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, as if the very atmosphere carried the weight of the curse. The door creaked open, revealing a tall, gaunt man in a butler's uniform. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed. "Monsieur Poirot," he intoned, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lord Blackthorne is expecting you. Please, follow me." Poirot followed the butler through the dimly lit foyer, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow his every move. At the end of the hall, a pair of double doors stood ajar, revealing a grand study. Inside, a man stood by the fireplace, his back to the door. He turned as Poirot entered, his face a mask of weariness and desperation. "Monsieur Poirot," Lord Blackthorne said, his voice strained, "thank you for coming. I fear we are running out of time." Poirot inclined his head, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the room, the crackling fire, the heavy drapes, the faint scent of old books and decay. "Tell me, Lord Blackthorne," he said, his tone calm but probing, "what is it that you fear?" Lord Blackthorne hesitated, his gaze flickering to the butler, who stood silently by the door. "Leave us, Grayson," he said. The butler bowed and withdrew, closing the doors behind him. Lord Blackthorne turned back to Poirot, his expression grim. "Chalice," he said, his voice trembling. "It has claimed another victim. My nephew Charles was found dead this morning, and the chalice, it has vanished." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning." Chapter 2. The Legend of the Chalice. The study was silent save for the crackling of the fire and the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Lord Blackthorne gestured for Poirot to take a seat in a high-backed leather chair, before settling himself into the one opposite. The flickering firelight cast shadows across his face, deepening the lines of worry etched into his features. "The chalice," Lord Blackthorne began, his voice low and measured, "has been in my family for centuries. It is said to have been crafted in the 12th century for a king's coronation, though which king no one can say for certain. What is certain, however, is that it has brought nothing but misery to those who possess it." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his hands steepled in front of him. "Misery, you say? Explain, if you please." Lord Blackthorne's gaze drifted to the fire, as if the flames held the answers he sought. "The first recorded tragedy occurred in 1487. My ancestor, Sir Edmund Blackthorne, was found dead in his bedchamber the night after he acquired the chalice. The official cause was ruled a heart seizure, but whispers of poison lingered. Then, in 1672, Lady Eleanor Blackthorne drowned in the manor's lake, mere days after she had worn the chalice during a family ceremony. The pattern continued through the generations, accidents, illnesses, even suicides, all tied to the chalice." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And yet the chalice remains in your possession. Why not destroy it or sell it, if it brings such misfortune?" Lord Blackthorne's lips tightened. "Pride, Monsieur Poirot, pride and tradition. The chalice is a symbol of our family's legacy. To part with it would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that we are powerless against this curse." "Curse," Poirot repeated, his tone neutral. "And you believe it to be real?" Lord Blackthorne hesitated, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair. "I did not truly, not until last month, when my brother Reginald died suddenly. He had been in perfect health, yet one morning he was found slumped over his desk, the chalice in his hands. The doctors called it a stroke, but I know better. And now, my nephew, Charles—" His voice broke, and he looked away. Poirot observed him carefully, noting the tremor in his hands, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. "Tell me about your nephew," he said gently. Lord Blackthorne took a deep breath, steadying himself. Charles was a young man, full of life. He had come to stay at the manor to help me manage the estate. Last night he was in high spirits, joking about the so-called curse. This morning he was found in the library, his face frozen in terror. The chalice was on the table beside him, but when I returned to the room after summoning the doctor, it was gone. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Gone? Who had access to the library? Only the household staff, Lord Blackthorne replied. Grayson, the butler, and Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper. They have been with the family for years. I cannot imagine either of them would steal the chalice. And yet, Poirot said, his voice thoughtful, it has disappeared. Tell me, Lord Blackthorne, who else is currently residing at the manor? Lord Blackthorne sighed. Aside from myself and the staff, there are 3 guests. Lady Beatrice, a distant cousin, Mr. Harold Wainwright, an antiquities dealer, and Miss Clara Finch, a journalist. They arrived yesterday, ostensibly to discuss the chalice's history. I suspect they have their own motives. Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. A journalist, you say, and an antiquities dealer. Most intriguing. Tell me, has anyone expressed a particular interest in the chalice? Lord Blackthorne nodded. Mr. Wainwright has been quite persistent in his inquiries. He claims to have a buyer interested in acquiring the chalice, though I have refused all offers. Lady Beatrice, too, has shown an unusual fascination with it, though she denies any ulterior motives. As for Miss Finch, she has been asking questions. Too many questions, if you ask me. Poirot rose from his chair, his movements deliberate. I would like to see the library, if you please. And then I should like to meet your guests. Lord Blackthorne stood as well, his expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. Of course, Grayson will show you the way. The library was a vast, dimly lit room, its walls lined with towering bookshelves filled with leather-bound tomes. A large oak table stood in the centre, its surface cluttered with papers and books. Poirot's sharp eyes immediately fell on the empty space where the chalice had supposedly been placed. "This is where your nephew was found?" Poirot asked, his voice calm but probing. "Yes," Lord Blackthorne replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was sitting here, as if he had been reading. But when I found him, his face, it was as if he had seen something horrifying." Poirot bent down, examining the table closely. His fingers brushed against a faint smudge on the polished wood, a circular mark, as if something had been placed there and then hastily removed. "Curious," he murmured. He straightened and turned to Lord Blackthorne. "I would like to speak with the staff and the guests. Alone, if you please." Lord Blackthorne nodded, his expression grave. "Of course. I will have Grayson assemble them in the drawing-room." As Lord Blackthorne left the library, Poirot remained for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room. His eyes lingered on a book lying open on the table, its pages filled with illustrations of medieval artifacts. One page, in particular, caught his attention, a detailed drawing of a chalice, its design strikingly similar to the description Lord Blackthorne had provided. Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. "Ah," he said softly. "The game, it is afoot." Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. The drawing-room of Blackthorn Manor was a study in contrasts. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the rich tapestries and polished furniture. Yet the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Poirot stood near the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, observing the assembled guests with the precision of a hawk surveying its prey. Lord Blackthorne had gathered the household, staff, and the 3 guests as requested. Grayson, the butler, stood stiffly by the door, his face impassive. Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, fidgeted with her apron, her eyes darting nervously around the room. The guests, Lady Beatrice, Mr. Harold Wainwright, and Miss Clara Finch, sat in a semicircle, their expressions ranging from curiosity to thinly veiled irritation. Poirot cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Thank you for joining me," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I am Hercule Poirot, and I have been asked to investigate the unfortunate events surrounding the Blackthorn Chalice. I would like to ask each of you a few questions. Rinchu." Beatrice, a woman in her late 40s with an air of aristocratic disdain, was the first to speak. "Questions? Really, Monsieur Poirot, is this necessary? We are all quite shaken by Charles' death, and this interrogation feels unnecessary." Poirot inclined his head. "I understand your discomfort, madam, but it is precisely because of the gravity of the situation that I must ask these questions. Every detail, no matter how small, may be of importance." Mr. Wainwright, a stout man with a bushy moustache and a keen glint in his eye, leaned forward. "Ask away, Monsieur Poirot. I, for one, have nothing to hide." Miss Finch, the journalist, adjusted her glasses and gave Poirot a small, knowing smile. "I'm all ears, monsieur. I'm quite curious to see how the famous Hercule Poirot works." Poirot's eyes twinkled briefly. "Very well, let us begin." Grayson, the butler Poirot, turned to Grayson first. "You were the one who discovered Mr. Charles Blackthorne's body, were you not?" Grayson nodded, his voice steady. "Yes, sir. I entered the library at 7 o'clock this morning, as is my custom, to open the curtains and prepare the room for the day. I found Mr. Charles seated at the table, his head resting on the desk. At first I thought he had fallen asleep, but when I approached—" He trailed off, his composure faltering for the first time. "Go on," Poirot encouraged gently. "I saw his face, sir. It was as if he had seen something terrible. I called for Lord Blackthorne immediately." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And the chalice? Was it still on the table when you found him?" "Yes, sir. It was right there, beside him. But when Lord Blackthorne returned with the doctor, it was gone." Poirot made a mental note of this discrepancy. "Did you notice anything unusual in the library? Anything out of place?" Grayson hesitated. "Not that I recall, sir, though the book on the table was open to a page about the chalice. I thought it odd, as Mr. Charles had never shown much interest in such things." "Thank you, Grayson," Poirot said, his tone thoughtful. Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper next. Poirot turned to Mrs. Holloway. "Madame, did you enter the library at any point this morning?" Mrs. Holloway shook her head vigorously. "No, sir. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. I didn't even know about Mr. Charles until Grayson came to fetch Lord Blackthorne." "And last night?" Poirot pressed. "Did you notice anything unusual?" Mrs. Holloway frowned, her hands twisting in her apron. "Well, now that you mention it, I did hear something. Late last night, after everyone had retired, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, but when I looked, there was no one there." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Footsteps, you say? From which direction?" "From the east wing, sir, near the library." "Thank you, madame. That is most helpful." Lady Beatrice Poirot turned his attention to Lady Beatrice. "Madam, you are a cousin of the Blackthorne family, are you not?" Lady Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "Yes, though a distant one. I came to discuss the chalice's history with Lord Blackthorne. It is a fascinating relic, though I must admit I find the cursed nonsense to be rather theatrical." "And yet," Poirot said, his tone mild, "you are here, in the midst of it. Tell me, where were you last night?" Lady Beatrice's lips tightened. "In my room, of course. I retired early with a book. I have no interest in wandering about this draughty old house at all hours." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "And your opinion of Mr. Charles?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering to Lord Blackthorne, who stood silently by the window. Charles was a charming young man, though perhaps a bit reckless. He had a tendency to meddle in things he didn't understand. "Such as the chalice?" Poirot asked. Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "I wouldn't know. I barely spoke to him." Mr. Harold Wainwright Poirot turned to the antiquities dealer. "Monsieur Wainwright, you have expressed interest in acquiring the chalice, have you not?" Wainwright chuckled, though his eyes remained sharp. "Guilty as charged, Monsieur Poirot. The chalice is a remarkable piece of history, and I have a client who is willing to pay a considerable sum for it, but Lord Blackthorne has refused all offers." "And yet," Poirot said, his tone deceptively light, "the chalice has now disappeared. Convenient, is it not?" Wainwright's smile faded. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with this?" "I suggest nothing," Poirot replied smoothly. "I merely observe. Tell me, where were you last night?" "In my room," Wainwright said firmly. "I had no reason to leave it." "Miss Clara Finch." Finally, Poirot turned to the journalist. "Mademoiselle Finch, you are here to write about the chalice, are you not?" Miss Finch adjusted her glasses, her expression calm. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. I'm working on a piece about cursed artifacts and their impact on modern society. The Blackthorn Chalice is a perfect case study." "And yet," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing slightly, "you arrived just before the chalice disappeared. Coincidence?" Miss Finch smiled faintly. "If I were the culprit, Monsieur Poirot, I would hardly draw attention to myself by arriving at such an inopportune time." Poirot's lips curved into a small smile. "A fair point, mademoiselle. Still, I must ask, where were you last night?" "In my room, writing," she replied. "I'm afraid I have no alibi, if that's what you're looking for." As the questioning concluded, Poirot stepped back, his mind racing. Each guest had provided answers, yet none had offered a clear motive or opportunity. The chalice's disappearance, the mysterious footsteps, the open book, all were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. "Thank you all for your cooperation," Poirot said at last. "I will need some time to reflect on what I have learned In the meantime, I would advise everyone to remain cautious. The killer, if there is one, may still be among us." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a shroud. Chapter 4. The first tragedy. The evening descended upon Blackthorn Manor like a shroud. The once grand halls now cloaked in an uneasy silence. Poirot retired to his room after the questioning, his mind a whirlwind of observations and deductions. The guests had dispersed, each retreating to their quarters with wary glances and hushed whispers. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as if the very walls of the manor were holding their breath. Poirot sat at the small writing desk in his room, his notebook open before him. He meticulously recorded the details of the day, the testimonies, the inconsistencies, the faint but unmistakable undercurrent of fear that seemed to bind everyone in the house. His pen paused as he recalled the open book in the library, its pages filled with illustrations of the chalice. What had Charles been researching? And why had the chalice vanished so abruptly after his death? A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, setting down his pen. The door creaked open, revealing Miss Clara Finch. She stepped inside, her expression a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Monsieur Poirot, may I have a moment of your time?" Poirot gestured to the chair opposite him. "Of course, mademoiselle, please sit." Miss Finch closed the door behind her and took a seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I couldn't help but notice your line of questioning earlier. You suspect one of us, don't you?" Poirot regarded her with a faint smile. "It is not a matter of suspicion, mademoiselle, but of logic. The chalice did not vanish on its own. Someone in this house took it, and that someone may also be responsible for Charles's death." Miss Finch leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What if I told you I might know something? Something that could help your investigation?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "I would be most grateful for any information you can provide." She hesitated, glancing toward the door as if ensuring they were alone. "Last night, after I retired to my room, I heard voices in the hallway. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I recognized one of them. It was Mr. Wainwright. He was arguing with someone, a woman. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded intense." Poirot's brow furrowed. "Did you see who he was speaking with?" Miss Finch shook her head. "No, but I'm certain it was a woman. Her voice was low, almost hissing. I didn't dare open my door to look." Poirot nodded, his mind racing. Wainwright had claimed to have been in his room all night, yet here was evidence to the contrary. "Thank you, mademoiselle. This is most helpful." Miss Finch rose from her chair, her expression earnest. "I want to help, Monsieur Poirot. This curse, it's nonsense, of course, but people are dying. If there's a killer among us, they need to be stopped." "Indeed," Poirot said, his tone grave. "And they will be. You have my word." As Miss Finch left, Poirot returned to his notebook, adding this new information to his growing list of clues. Wainwright's late-night argument, the mysterious woman, the missing chalice. It was all connected. He was certain of it. But how? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden commotion downstairs, a sharp cry followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Poirot rose quickly, his instincts on high alert. He opened his door to find Grayson rushing down the hallway, his face pale. Monsieur Poirot, the butler exclaimed, his voice trembling. You must come quickly. It's Lady Beatrice. She's been found unconscious in the garden. Poirot's heart quickened. And lead the way, he said, his tone sharp. The garden was bathed in the cold light of the moon, the shadows of the hedges stretching like grasping fingers. Lady Beatrice lay on the ground near the fountain, her body crumpled and still. Lord Blackthorne knelt beside her, his face a mask of shock and despair. Is she? Poirot began, his voice low. Alive, Lord Blackthorne replied, his voice hoarse, but barely. We've sent for the doctor, but... Poirot crouched beside Lady Beatrice, his keen eyes taking in every detail. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. A faint, acrid smell lingered in the air, a smell Poirot recognized all too well. Poison, he murmured, his voice grim. Lord Blackthorne's eyes widened. Poison? But how? Who would do such a thing? Poirot did not answer immediately. His gaze fell on the fountain, where a small glimmering object lay half submerged in the water. He reached out and plucked it from the basin, holding it up to the moonlight. It was a teaspoon, its handle engraved with the Blackthorne crest. Curious, Poirot said, his voice barely above a whisper. Most curious. Chapter 5. The Web. Of lies, the manor was in chaos. Lady Beatrice had been carried inside and laid on a chaise lounge in the drawing-room, her breathing shallow and uneven. The doctor, a harried man with a bag of instruments, arrived shortly after and began his examination. Poirot stood nearby, his sharp eyes observing every detail, while the other guests hovered anxiously in the doorway. Lord Blackthorne paced the room, his face ashen. "This is madness," he muttered. "First Charles, now Beatrice. Who will be next?" Poirot approached him, his voice calm but firm. "Lord Blackthorne, I must ask, was Lady Beatrice in possession of anything unusual before this incident? A letter, perhaps? Or an object?" Lord Blackthorne shook his head. "Not that I know of. She kept to herself most of the time. But wait." He paused, his brow furrowing. "Earlier today she mentioned receiving a note. She said it was nothing, just a reminder about some family matter. I didn't think much of it at the time." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A note, you say? Do you know where it might be?" "In her room, perhaps," Lord Blackthorne replied, "but I wouldn't know where to look." Poirot turned to Grayson, who stood silently by the door. "Grayson, would you accompany me to Lady Beatrice's room? We must find this note." The butler nodded, his expression grave. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot." Lady Beatrice's room was a reflection of her personality. Elegant but austere, with little in the way of personal touches. Poirot moved methodically, his eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. He began with the writing desk, opening drawers and sifting through papers. "Ah," he murmured, pulling a folded sheet of stationery from a drawer. The note was brief, written in a hurried hand. "Meet me in the garden at midnight. Do not tell anyone. The chalice must be dealt with." There was no signature, but the tone was urgent, almost desperate. Poirot held the note up to the light, examining the paper and ink. "Curious," he said. "The handwriting is unfamiliar, but the phrasing, it suggests someone with intimate knowledge of the chalice's significance." Grayson frowned. "Do you think Lady Beatrice was lured into a trap?" "It is possible," Poirot replied. But why her? What role does she play in this mystery? As he pondered this, his gaze fell on a small ornate box on the bedside table. He opened it to find a collection of letters, tied together with a ribbon. The topmost letter bore the seal of the Blackthorne family. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Grayson, do you recognize this seal?" The butler stepped closer, his expression tightening. "Yes, sir. That is Lord Blackthorne's personal seal." "But why would Lady Beatrice have a letter from him?" Poirot untied the ribbon and skimmed the contents of the letter. His lips pressed into a thin line as he read. "This is not a letter from Lord Blackthorne," he said. "It is a forgery. Someone has been impersonating him." Grayson's eyes widened. "But to what end?" "To manipulate," Poirot replied. "To sow discord and confusion, and, perhaps, to cover their tracks." Back in the drawing-room, the doctor had finished his examination. He turned to Poirot and Lord Blackthorne, his expression grim. "Lady Beatrice has been poisoned, as you suspected. The toxin appears to be arsenic, administered in a small dose. She is fortunate to be alive." Lord Blackthorne sank into a chair, his face pale. "Arsenic? But how? Who would do such a thing?" Poirot held up the note he had found. "This was in Lady Beatrice's room. It appears she was lured to the garden under false pretences. The poison was likely administered there." Miss Finch, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. "Monsieur Poirot, may I see the note?" Poirot handed it to her, watching her reaction closely. She studied it for a moment, her brow furrowing. "This handwriting? It looks familiar." "Familiar?" Poirot asked, his tone sharp. Miss Finch hesitated. "I can't be certain, but it resembles Mr. Wainwright's. I saw him writing in his notebook earlier today, and the slant of the letters is similar." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A most interesting observation, mademoiselle. Thank you." Mr. Wainwright, who had been standing near the fireplace, stiffened. "What are you implying? That I wrote that note? Preposterous!" Poirot turned to him, his expression calm but probing. "Monsieur Wainwright, where were you at midnight?" Wainwright's face flushed. "In my room, as I said earlier. I have no reason to lie." "And yet," Poirot said, his tone mild, "Miss Finch heard you arguing with a woman last night. Who was it, if not Lady Beatrice?" Wainwright's composure faltered. I don't know what you're talking about." Poirot stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "The truth, monsieur. It will come out eventually. It always does." Wainwright glanced around the room, his eyes darting from face to face. For a moment it seemed he might confess, but then he straightened, his expression hardening. "I have nothing more to say." As the tension in the room reached its peak, Poirot turned to Lord Blackthorne. "I must ask you to gather everyone in the library. There is something I wish to show them." Lord Blackthorne nodded, his expression grim. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot." Chapter 6. The hidden clue, the library, was silent, save for the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth. The guests and staff of Blackthorne Manor stood in a semicircle, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Poirot stood at the centre, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression inscrutable. On the table before him lay the forged letter, the mysterious note, and the teaspoon from the fountain. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice calm but commanding. "We are gathered here because a great injustice has been committed. 2 lives have been endangered, 1 lost, 1 hanging by a thread. The chalice, a relic of your family's history, has vanished. And yet the truth remains hidden, obscured by lies and deceit." He paused, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "But the truth, it has a way of revealing itself. And today it begins with this." He held up the teaspoon, its engraved handle glinting in the firelight. "This was found in the fountain near where Lady Beatrice was poisoned. It bears the Blackthorn crest, yet it is not part of the household's current set. It is old, perhaps even antique. Tell me, Lord Blackthorne, do you recognize it?" Lord Blackthorne stepped forward, his brow furrowed. He took the spoon from Poirot and examined it closely. This belonged to my grandfather. It was part of a set he commissioned decades ago, but I haven't seen it in years." "How did it end up in the fountain?" Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. "That is the question, is it not? And the answer lies in the connection between this spoon and the chalice." He turned to the assembled group. "The chalice, as you know, is said to be cursed. But curses, they are often the work of men, not magic. And men, they leave traces, clues, like this spoon." Miss Finch, who had been watching intently, spoke up. "Monsieur Poirot, are you suggesting that the spoon was used to administer the poison?" "Precisely, mademoiselle," Poirot replied. "Arsenic, as the doctor confirmed, was the toxin used. It is bitter, yes, but when dissolved in tea or another strong beverage, it can be easily concealed. And what better tool to stir it than a spoon that no one would think to look for?" Mr. Wainwright, who had been standing at the edge of the group, scoffed. "This is all speculation. You have no proof." Poirot's gaze shifted to him, his eyes narrowing. "Proof, monsieur, is what I seek, and I believe it lies in the chalice itself." He turned to Lord Blackthorne. "You mentioned that the chalice vanished after Charles's death. But what if it was never truly gone? What if it was hidden, waiting to be retrieved at the right moment?" Lord Blackthorne's eyes widened. "You think it's still in the house?" "I am certain of it," Poirot said, "and I believe I know where." He stepped over to the bookshelf, where the open book about medieval artifacts still lay. He ran his fingers along the spines of the neighbouring books, his movements deliberate. Suddenly, he paused, his fingers brushing against a small, almost imperceptible groove in the wood. "Ah," he murmured. He pressed the groove, and with a soft click, a hidden compartment in the bookshelf slid open. Inside, nestled in a velvet-lined cavity, was the Blackthorn Chalice. The room erupted in gasps. Lord Blackthorne stepped forward, his face pale. How did you know?" Poirot turned to him, his expression grave. "The book was a clue. It was open to a page about the chalice, yes, but it was also slightly askew, as if it had been moved recently. And the dust on the shelf, it was disturbed. Someone had been here searching for something." He lifted the chalice from its hiding place, his eyes scanning it closely. And here, on the rim, a faint residue. Arsenic, perhaps? The doctor stepped forward, taking the chalice from Poirot. He examined it briefly, then nodded. "Yes, this could certainly be the source of the poison." Poirot turned to the group, his gaze sweeping over each face. The chalice was not cursed. It was a tool used to conceal a far more sinister plot. and the killer, they are among us still. Chapter 7. The Second Murder. The revelation of the chalice's hidden location sent a ripple of shock through the Hague room. Lord Blackthorne stared at the relic in the doctor's hands, his face a mixture of relief and dread. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their early attention now sharpened by the knowledge that the killer was among them. Poirot, ever the picture of calm, placed the chalice carefully on the table and turned to address the group. The chalice, as we now know, was not cursed. It was a tool, a means to an end. But the question remains, who used it and why? Miss Finch, her journalist's instincts clearly piqued, stepped forward. Monsieur Poirot, if the chalice was used to administer poison, then the killer must have had access to it. Who among us could have hidden it in the bookshelf? Poirot's eyes gleamed. An excellent question, mademoiselle. The answer lies in the details. The hidden compartment was not common knowledge, yet someone found it. This suggests familiarity with the manor's secrets. Lord Blackthorne frowned. The compartment was built by my grandfather. Only a handful of people knew of its existence. Myself, Grayson, and perhaps a few others in the family. Poirot nodded. Precisely. Which narrows our list of suspects considerably. Mr. Wainwright, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly interjected. This is absurd. You're accusing us based on a hidden compartment? How do we know you didn't plant the chalice there yourself? Poirot turned to him, his expression unruffled. A fair question, monsieur. But consider this. The chalice was found with traces of arsenic. If I had planted it, how would I have obtained the poison? And why would I go to such lengths to implicate myself? Wainwright opened his mouth to retort, but was cut off by a sudden commotion in the hallway. Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, burst into the room, her face pale and her hands trembling. Monsieur Poirot, Lord Blackthorne, you must come quickly. It's Mr. Grayson. He's been found in the study. He's dead. The room erupted into chaos. Lord Blackthorne staggered back, his face ashen. Miss Finch gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Even Poirot, usually unflappable, showed a flicker of surprise. Led the way, he said, his voice sharp. The study was a scene of grim disorder. Grayson lay slumped over the desk, his face frozen in a mask of shock. A half-empty glass of brandy sat beside him, its contents untouched. Poirot approached the body, his keen eyes taking in every detail. Poisoned, he murmured, bending, to examine the glass. The same method as before. Arsenic, most likely. Lord Blackthorne sank into a chair, his voice barely above a whisper. Grayson, he's been with the family for decades. Who would do this? Poirot straightened, his expression grave. Someone who felt threatened by his knowledge. Grayson knew the manor's secrets, perhaps too many secrets. Miss Finch, who had followed the group to the study, stepped forward. Monsieur Poirot, do you think Grayson was involved in the murders, or was he simply a loose end? Poirot's eyes narrowed. That remains to be seen. But his death is no coincidence. It is a calculated move designed to silence him. He turned to Lord Blackthorne. Tell me, was Grayson acting strangely in the days leading up to this? Lord Blackthorne hesitated, his brow furrowed. Now that you mention it, he did seem preoccupied. I assumed it was the stress of recent events, but perhaps there was more to it. Poirot nodded. Precisely. Grayson knew something that made him a threat to the killer, and now he has paid the price. He turned to the group, his gaze sweeping over each face. The killer is among us, and they are growing desperate. We must act quickly before they strike again. Chapter 8. The Final Deduction. The study was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Grayson's body had been covered with a sheet, but the weight of his death lingered in the air. Poirot stood by the desk, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp eyes scanning the room for clues. The guests and staff had gathered once more, their faces pale and their voices hushed. Lord Blackthorne, visibly shaken, broke the silence. Monsieur Poirot, what do we do now? Grayson is dead, and the killer is still at large. How do we stop them? Poirot turned to him, his expression calm but resolute. We stop them by uncovering the truth. And the truth, Lord Blackthorne, lies in the details. He stepped closer to the desk, his gaze falling on the half-empty glass of brandy. This glass, he said, lifting it carefully, is the key. Grayson did not drink from it. The poison was meant for someone else. Miss Finch, who had been standing near the doorway, frowned. What do you mean? If Grayson didn't drink, why was he poisoned? Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. Because, mademoiselle, he was not the intended target. The killer made a mistake. He turned to the group, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. Let us reconstruct the events. Grayson entered the study, presumably to retrieve something or to speak with someone. He poured a glass of brandy, but before he could drink it, he was interrupted. The killer, perhaps unaware that Grayson had not consumed the poison, struck him down to ensure his silence. Mr. Wainwright, who had been pacing nervously, stopped abruptly. This is all conjecture. You have no proof. Ah, but I do, Poirot replied, his tone mild but firm. He reached into his pocket and produced a small crumpled piece of paper. This was found in Grayson's hand. It is a note written in the same hand as the one that lured Lady Beatrice to the garden. He unfolded the note and read aloud. Meet me in the study at midnight. We must discuss the chalice. Do not tell anyone. Miss Finch's eyes widened. So Grayson was lured here, just like Lady Beatrice. Precisely, Poirot said. But there is more. The handwriting on this note matches that of the forged letter in Lady Beatrice's room. And the ink, it is the same as that used in Mr. Wainwright's notebook. All eyes turned to Wainwright, who stiffened. This is outrageous. You're trying to frame me. Poirot's gaze was steady. I do not frame, monsieur. I deduce, and the evidence points to you. Wainwright's face flushed with anger. You have no proof. This is all circumstantial. Perhaps, Poirot conceded. But let us consider the facts. You are an antiquities dealer with a keen interest in the chalice. You have the knowledge to forge documents and the motive to eliminate anyone who stands in your way. And you were heard arguing with Lady Beatrice the night she was poisoned. Wainwright's composure faltered. I had nothing to do with this. Poirot stepped closer, his voice low but piercing. Then explain the arsenic in your possession. The room fell silent. Wainwright's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. but there was none. Finally he slumped into a chair, his face pale. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered. "I only wanted the chalice. It's worth a fortune. But Grayson, he knew too much. He was going to expose me." Lord Blackthorne stepped forward, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You killed my nephew! And Grayson, for a piece of silver?" Wainwright looked up, his eyes filled with desperation. "It's not just a piece of silver. It's history, power, and I was so close." Poirot's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You were close, monsieur, but you made one fatal mistake. You underestimated the power of truth." Chapter 9. The Unmasking. The study was thick with tension, the weight of Wainwright's confession pressing heavily on the room. Poirot stood, at the centre his posture calm, but commanding, while the others, Lord Blackthorne, Miss Finch, and the remaining staff, stared at Wainwright in stunned silence. The antiquities dealer sat slumped in his chair, his earlier bravado replaced by a hollow resignation. "You admit, then," Poirot said, his voice steady, "to the poisoning of Charles Blackthorne and Grayson, as well as the attempted murder of Lady Beatrice?" Wainwright's hands trembled as he ran them through his hair. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I only wanted the chalice. It was supposed to be simple. But Grayson, he knew too much. He saw me with the arsenic. I had no choice." Lord Blackthorne stepped forward, his face a mask of fury and grief. "No choice? You killed my nephew, my family, for a relic. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Wainwright flinched but said nothing. Poirot, ever the mediator, raised a hand to calm the room. "Lord Blackthorne, I understand your anger, but we must allow the law to take its course. Monsieur Wainwright will face justice for his crimes." Miss Finch, who had been quietly observing the scene, spoke up. "Monsieur Poirot, how did you know it was him? What was the final clue?" Poirot turned to her, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "The final clue, mademoiselle, was the teaspoon." He reached into his pocket and produced the engraved spoon, holding it up for all to see. "This spoon, as we know, is an antique from the Blackthorne collection. It was used to stir the arsenic into the brandy. But what is most telling is its origin. Monsieur Wainwright, as an antiquities dealer, would have had access to such items. And the arsenic, it is a substance often used in the preservation of old artifacts. His profession gave him both the means and the opportunity." Wainwright let out a bitter laugh. "You think you're so clever, don't you? But you're wrong about one thing. I didn't act alone." The room fell silent once more. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Explain yourself, monsieur." Wainwright leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "Lady Beatrice. She was in on it from the beginning. She wanted the chalice as much as I did. She forged the letters, lured Charles to the library, and even helped me hide the chalice in the bookshelf. But when things started to go wrong, she turned on me. She was going to expose me to save herself." Miss Finch gasped. "Lady Beatrice! But she's in no condition to defend herself." Poirot's expression darkened. "A convenient accusation, monsieur, but one that will be difficult to prove given her current state." Wainwright's lips curled into a sneer. "Believe what you want, but you'll see. She's just as guilty as I am." Poirot turned to Lord Blackthorne. We must ensure Lady Beatrice is closely monitored. If what Monsieur Wainwright says is true, she may still be in danger, or she may pose a danger to others." Lord Blackthorne nodded, his face grim. "I'll have the doctor keep watch over her, and I'll send for the police at once." As the group dispersed, Poirot remained in the study, his mind racing. Wainwright's confession had answered many questions, but it had also raised new ones. Was Lady Beatrice truly involved? And if so, to what extent? He stepped over to the desk, where Grayson's body still lay. Kneeling, he examined the floor beneath the desk, his keen eyes catching a faint glimmer of metal. He reached down and retrieved a small key, its surface tarnished with age. "Curious," he murmured, turning the key over in his hand. "What secrets do you hold?" Chapter 10. The Resolution. The key Poirot found beneath Grayson's desk was small and unassuming, yet it held the weight of the final mystery. Its tarnished surface gleamed faintly in the firelight as he turned it over in his hand, his mind racing with possibilities. What door did it unlock, and what secrets lay behind it? Poirot stepped out of the study and into the hallway, where Lord Blackthorne was speaking in hushed tones with Miss Finch. The journalist's face was pale, her earlier curiosity now tempered by the gravity of the situation. "Monsieur Poirot," Lord Blackthorne said, noticing his approach, "the police have been summoned. They should be here within the hour." Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That is well, Lord Blackthorne. But there is one more matter to attend to before they arrive." He held up the key, its significance clear in his eyes. "This was found beneath Grayson's desk. I believe it may unlock something of great importance." Miss Finch's eyes widened. "Another hidden compartment? Or perhaps a safe?" "Precisely," Poirot replied. "And I suspect it holds the final piece of this puzzle." Lord Blackthorne frowned. "I don't recall any safes or locked compartments. In the study, where do you propose we look?" Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. "The library, of course. It is the heart of this mystery, and it is where the chalice was hidden. It stands to reason that it may hold other secrets, as, well, the library was dimly lit, the fire in the hearth casting long shadows across the room." Poirot moved with purpose, his sharp eyes scanning the shelves and furniture for any sign of a lock or hidden mechanism. Miss Finch and Lord Blackthorne followed, closely, their anticipation palpable. "What are we looking for, exactly?" Miss Finch asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A lock," Poirot replied, "one that matches this key. It may be concealed, so we must be thorough." They searched, in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of books and the crackling of the fire. After several minutes, Miss Finch let out a soft exclamation. "Monsieur Poirot, over here!" Poirot hurried to her side, where she stood before a section of the bookshelf. The wood appeared ordinary at first glance, but upon closer inspection, a small, almost imperceptible keyhole was visible near the base of one of the shelves. "Ah," Poirot murmured, his eyes gleaming. "Well done, mademoiselle." He inserted the key and turned it gently. There was a soft click, and a hidden drawer slid open. Inside lay a stack of letters, tied together with a ribbon, and a small leather-bound journal. Lord Blackthorne leaned forward, his expression a mixture of curiosity and dread. "What is this?" Poirot carefully untied the ribbon and began to read the letters. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the contents, his expression growing increasingly grave. "These letters," he said at last, "are correspondence between Grayson and Lady Beatrice. They reveal a plot to steal the chalice and sell it to a private collector. Grayson was to provide access to the manor, while Lady Beatrice was to forge the necessary documents." Miss Finch gasped. So Wainwright was telling the truth? Lady Beatrice was involved? Poirot nodded. It would seem so, but there is more. He opened the journal and began to read aloud. "The chalice is not merely a relic. It is a key to a fortune hidden by the Blackthorne family generations ago. The curse was a ruse, designed to keep the secret safe. But now the time has come to claim what is rightfully mine." Lord Blackthorne's face paled. "A fortune? What is he talking about?" Poirot closed the journal, his expression sombre. "It would appear, Lord Blackthorne, that your family's history is far more complex than you realized. The chalice was not merely a symbol of your legacy. It was a clue to a hidden treasure, and Grayson and Lady Beatrice sought to claim it for themselves." Miss Finch's eyes widened. "But why involve Wainwright? And why kill Charles?" Poirot sighed. "Wainwright was a means to an end, a buyer with the resources to make their scheme profitable. As for Charles, he likely discovered their plot and threatened to expose them. Grayson and Lady Beatrice saw no other option but to silence him." Lord Blackthorne sank into a chair, his face a mask of shock and despair. "All this time I had no idea. My own family, my own staff." Poirot placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "The truth, Lord Blackthorne, is often painful, but it is better to know it than to live in ignorance." The arrival of the police marked the end of the investigation. Wainwright was taken into custody, his confession ensuring his conviction. Lady Beatrice, still unconscious, was placed under guard, her fate to be determined by the courts. And the hidden fortune, its location still a mystery, became the subject of a new chapter in the Blackthorne family's history. As Poirot prepared to depart, Lord Blackthorne approached him, his gratitude evident. "Monsieur Poirot, I cannot thank you enough. You have saved my family from ruin." Poirot inclined his head. "It is my duty, Lord Blackthorne. But remember, the past has a way of resurfacing. Guard your secrets well." With that, Poirot stepped into the waiting car, his mind already turning to the next mystery.